Good day. It sure is a pleasure to join you all at the UI Rangeland Center's Fall Forum for 2020. My name's Tim Murphy, and I'm the chairperson for the Rangeland Center's Partner Advisory Council, known as the PAC. The PAC is in service to the University of Idaho Rangeland Center, where we provide long-range and broad-scale concepts to help set strategic goals for the center. PAC offers ideas and works with center members to develop specific projects and partnerships, and help secure resources to accomplish the center's work. Based on a strategic plan, the PAC conducts annual reviews and does offer recommendations for the center's work. And always, the PAC is a strong advocate for the center's efforts, telling the story, sharing the center's success with stakeholders, constituents, and decision makers. The PAC currently does have 3 vacant member positions. Give some thought to becoming a PAC member, joining us, and how you could assist the PAC and in turn strongly support the UI Rangeland Center's mission. If you're interested, please contact myself, Wendy Pratt, she's vice chair for the PAC, or Dr. Launchball to visit about membership. These are some interesting times and challenges for rangelands, no? And the folks and communities who depend on healthy rangelands that support business and economics, from ranching to outfitting and guiding, and for people seeking a broad array of recreational opportunities. Rangelands offer vast open working landscapes, and everyone's keen on getting their fair share of a fixed pie. Well, with unprecedented population growth, old areas of concern can get heightened and new challenges arise, many of them not even imagined decades ago. The UI Rangeland Center is well positioned to address these challenges. In these times, a comment from the book, Stitching the West Back Together, is always good counsel as we work together to address today's issues and identify coming challenges and needs. It's a short quote, and it works for me. We're defined more by the ground we share than by the interests that have divided us. I genuinely appreciate the leadership from Dr. Karen Launchball and all Rangeland Center members. As well, the efforts by Director Catherine Hines at the McClure Center have been important and helpful in identifying and enabling projects that address today's questions and needs involving rangelands. Thank you, and I'm sure looking forward to this year's Fall Forum 2020, review, reimagine, and reposition. Thank you very much. Good day.
There we go. Well, we're just 1 minute after the hour, and so here we are at the last day of the Fall Forum. So good to see you all. Thanks for joining us. We had a really great session yesterday. We had a great session last night. I was really impressed with the number of people that weighed in and tried to help us think about range. So remember, this theme of the Fall Forum is revisit. So we did that with some speakers yesterday. Think about how the industry, ranching and land management have changed and how the land has changed. Last night we talked about reimagining. How do we reposition, or how do we think about a new world? Today we're going to talk about some ideas on the horizon that might help us actually reposition and reface that new world. So I just wanted to give you a few tips, and then just start thinking of this. We're going to find out who all is out there. So we're going to do a little poll and see where y'all are from. But first of all, I want to just make sure, you know, this is a webinar, not a meeting, a Zoom meeting. So you are muted and there's no video, so you can wear whatever you want, go get coffee if you need it, etc. Also, another cool thing, we are keeping track of who's at this meeting, and we're giving away door prizes. So the CALS Publishing, publishing over in the College of Ag and Life Sciences, has given us some books that they publish to give to you, for such as the Rangeland Plants of Idaho and the Idaho Field Guide to Grasses and Grass-like Plants, and a few others. Weeds of Idaho also, so make sure that you are up on your plants. We'll have that as door prizes. Then the last thing I want to make sure you know is on the bottom of your screen, there is, you'll see a Q&A. So if you have questions as we go through, both the hosts and Eric Winford will be monitoring those questions, and so we'll hopefully be able to get those to the speakers. Again, I'm going to thank Eric Winford, the Associate Director of the Range Center. He's the guy that's behind all this and making sure it's working, and Crystal Callahan from the McClure Center has been great in keeping this going. So again, we're at the Rangeland Fall Forum, thanks to the Rangeland Center at the University of Idaho, which I direct, but also Catherine Himes from the McClure Center. They are a partner of ours, and the Idaho section of the Society for Range Management. So now, Eric, why don't you go ahead and launch that poll and see where these folks are from. So go ahead and weigh in. Oh, here they're. Wow, excellent. Okay, it looks like everyone's about done, Eric. It seems that there's a lot of rangeland in southern Idaho, so it's not surprising that quite a few folks are from southern Idaho. And but I'm happy to see some of my colleagues from up here at north are here. And then look at, there's quite a few folks from outside of Idaho. So thanks for joining us. And Eric, thanks for launching that poll. So I think you can go ahead and stop that now. I'm not sure if I can. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I want to start, and I'm going to introduce the first speaker, the first set of speakers, but I really think that you might have seen at least the tail end of the introduction that Tim Murphy, who's the director of the Rangeland Center, our Partners Advisory Council, he once got me onto this book about stitching the West back together again, and he gave this quote, and I think it's worth re-saying, that we are more defined by the ground that we share than the interests that divide us. And as we go into the future and we try to reposition ourselves, it's all about trying to find some unity, because we're all facing the same kind of future. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike Kuyper and April Hulet to get their microphones and video on so we can see those folks. They're going to give us this first session of this reposition session. Mike Kuyper is one of the ones that's representing the Society for Range Management. He's the director of the section that's down in the Lyman-Richmond section, which is down in southeast Idaho. Mike is a BLM range specialist, actually got his degree at Washington State University, not too far from us up here. Mark's in charge of kind of all things range and natural resource out of the Pocatello office. He's doing quite a lot of work across that part of the state. And so Mike is going to work with April Hulet, one of my colleagues here at the University of Idaho. She's a restoration ecologist and a range professor and a great teacher, from every kid as short and small as a few years old to college students. So April and Mike, welcome. And Mike, I think that you're in charge now.
All right. So I'll have April share her screen so that she can present the slideshows. So we were asked to present this in kind of a podcast type format, which I just learned what a podcast was the other day when I Googled it. So with that in mind, April's going to show some slides, and it's going to spur discussion between me and April. So this will be a more discussion between probably two colleagues, looking at different slides and talking about that. So the other thing that is important to keep in mind, that we're going to try and make sure all viewpoints are discussed as we go through the slides. I'm really good at playing devil's advocate, so I'll probably be doing that quite a bit. And then the other thing is, feel free to post questions. I'm going to try and keep the question answer box open. So as we go through these slides, if you see something that you have a question on or have a comment, please post it, and I'll try and fold it into our discussion so we don't have to answer a lot of questions at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to April.
Perfect. So I hope you guys can hear me. This is kind of interesting because I guess you can. Mike, I can see your face.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm excited today to work with Mike and to talk about some of the opportunities that we have in the future, especially for our rangelands. I think there's a lot of good opportunities. But one of the first things that we always need to do is just make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So we were given the title to look at ways to restore and to improve rangelands. And so I went to the Society for Ecological Restoration and looked at their definition. And this is kind of the guideline for what we're talking about. When we think about these concepts, we're really trying to assist the recovery. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we can't guarantee we're going to get anywhere, but we can definitely start moving towards some kind of trajectory, and specifically the historic state is often what we go to. And what that is, I mean, you can kind of define it. But along the path to get there, there's a lot of different things we can do to try to reposition the rangeland. So some of the things that we'll
April, can I interrupt you there real quick? So as we go through, I think one of the things will be interesting is what is a historic trajectory. So when, and as we go through these slides, and even the slide that's up right now, some of those might be able to be a little bit of improvement to continue on that historic trajectory, but what is the definition of historic, bringing something back towards that historic trajectory if you're in a cheatgrass dominated community?
Well, that's a good point. I think it can change depending on where you are and what you want to achieve on the landscape. Right, but a lot of times we think it's a reference community or something that's been more or less undisturbed for an extensive period of time, and kind of a goal that we can get to. And like you mentioned, there are so many different variations within that, but that's one of the important things about repositioning ourselves on rangeland is we all have to be, or we all have to have the same goal when we're starting, and we can work through that together, hopefully. So I didn't answer, I didn't define it, but we're getting closer, I think. So one of the things that we want to just make sure we point out is that rangelands are really dynamic and complex. They're always changing, and there's never one treatment that's going to work for everything, or one restoration effort that will guarantee that you get success year after year. And all of these abiotic and biotic factors are really important to consider when we're choosing any kind of restoration treatment. And we'll go through quite a few of these today. Legacy effect, that's one that people often have questions. So sometimes we think about, well, thinking of yesterday when we heard from Wendy and Seth about revisiting the past, what's the history of the land? What's the grazing happened? Is there going to be legacy effects from that? So it's important to have a complete picture anytime we're trying to do a treatment on the land. This is an example of why climate is so important, or precipitation specifically, why we might have success or failures when we're repositioning a landscape. So on the left, you have Oahe County, excuse me, and on the right, you have Oneida County. And they're similar elevations, but they have different average precipitations. In between the red bar lines, that's the average plus or minus 1. And so you can see every year there's a huge fluctuation. Sometimes we're above, a lot of times we're below, but we can't predict this, yet it determines a lot of our success when we're thinking about restoration.
Yeah, and April, one of the things that I think is important for those that were able to watch the presentations, the very first presentations yesterday, one of the discussions was, and I can't remember who was presenting, but they were talking about our crested seeding and or seedings and how to maybe put in other vegetation, herbaceous forbs or other kind of grasses inside of crested seeding. And it was interesting because he said if you pick the right years to do that, he thinks it could be successful, right? Well, looking at the graphs here, I think that's a really important note is that how do you pick the right year of when you're going to seed? When every single year, just looking at those graphs, it looks like quite a few of them are below the average. So you never really know, and I know farther in this presentation we'll look at a treatment and look at the precipitation, but like you said, it's complex, and I think that's probably one of the biggest unknown factors is what is your precipitation going to be following the treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't have predictions that are super helpful at this point. I mean, or maybe ever.
Hey, I buy the Farmer's Almanac every year, so
yeah.
Don't tell me that.
So what's going to happen? Just kidding. No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, this fluctuation is extreme on almost all rangelands, and we're going off a 30-year average. So in these graphs, it's the 1980s through 2010 is how they're getting those numbers. So I think it's really interesting when you look at the Oneida County graph, for example. If you look pre-1980, I mean, I would say the average is definitely lower than what it is today. So is that a factor of climate change? Is it starting to shift that direction, or did we just have a few anomaly years where we have really high precipitation? So it's like you said, there's no prediction, but it's definitely important, and it can determine whether we're successful or whether we fail at our treatments. And either way, we have to acknowledge that that's a possibility, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. The other one that we talked about that's really important is to think about your soil types. So this is just an example of an 1,800 acre area. And within this, we have 8 or 9 different map units. And map units are pretty much just based on the components in the soil as well as some land features. So it doesn't necessarily mean that when we do restoration efforts, we have to manage for all these different soil map units or that they'll respond differently. But we should be aware that the soils are definitely going to influence what kind of recovery we have on a landscape, and maybe a good explanation as to why something does work or doesn't work in a particular area. And then we can start gaining knowledge and building that as we continue on.
April, I think I would add on that previous slide is just because when you look at the soil map and it has different soils mapped, several of those soils might still have the exact same ESD or might support the same dominant vegetation. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at it is even though it has a lot of different soils, you still might be able to do one treatment type across the majority of the area.
Yeah, absolutely. So this one has 2 ecological site descriptions associated with it. And so that's often the scale that we manage, but that's another question that you have to think about when you're choosing treatments. What scale is appropriate for what your goals and objectives are? And another one that we didn't mention is land ownership, right? So a lot of times this can also have multiple landowners. So it makes it more complicated, but definitely something that we can still achieve if we have open communications with others. So the other thing, we're going to talk about some examples, and I work a lot with fire, and so I look at the landscape a little bit differently than maybe Mike. So he might see plants where I see fuel a lot of times. And I kind of have the perspective of it's not necessarily if it burns, but when it burns, how can we make sure that we have a community that's resilient to fire, meaning that it's going to come back after a disturbance, and also resistant to exotic annual grasses. And one of the primary components that makes the landscape resistant is these perennial bunch grasses. Like we've all seen this picture, but I really think it's important to remember that these perennial bunch grasses and the root systems are really such a great tool that we have to minimize invasion on the landscape. We want to make sure they're established and healthy and that they're present. So when it does burn, they come back and they can help us avoid invasion.
And April, I think one of the things that we had talked about, and you can even go to the next slide, but if people keep this slide in mind, is a lot of people look at the sagebrush and it does have a deep root mass and it does kind of spread out. So it actually provides some protection against cheatgrass invasion while it's present. So maybe the upper right photo in this current slide. The main difference being that between herbaceous vegetation, grasses, blue bunch wheatgrass, crested, and shrubs is once it burns, the shrubs are not going to come back as fast as your perennial grasses. And so then it just opens up all those niches for cheatgrass.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at the root differences. I don't know if I can go back. But yeah, so I mean, the fibrous roots though are really different on those two, and the duration it takes, right, to become competitive. So it's not saying that perennial bunch grasses are the only competitive species, but one of the primary ones. So when we're doing these management treatments, I always like to think in steps. How am I going to restore a landscape? And that could be maintaining a landscape, or it can be making a change. But I always kind of go through a 5-step process, or if I'm ever asked to help anyone or to think about a landscape on a large scale, I like to go through these questions. So the first one is really, what's the goal and objective for the landscape? This is going to determine a lot of directions that you want to go. This is definitely the most complicated part, I think, of repositioning any kind of range, right? We all need to have the same goal, or at least similar goals and objectives, if we're going to collaborate and work together. And then after we see or we have a plan of kind of where we want to go, we always have to make sure we understand the current conditions of the landscape, but also start figuring out, so what's the desired community going to look like? So once you have these three things established and agreed upon, which I will say can take years, then you can start to select these strategies and tactics that will work on the landscape. And then, as mentioned by a lot of the past speakers, monitoring is obviously a critical component. So with a lot of different factors, we're not guaranteed to succeed, but man, the sooner we can tell if a treatment does or doesn't work, the better, because then we can either continue on that path or make some kind of change to hopefully, again, get closer to that plant community or that goal that we've set. So I think we should go through some examples.
Did you have a, did we want to post the question to the group of shrub densities?
Yeah, definitely. So you can see in these pictures that we have a lot of shrubs. Well, okay, see, I've already biased you. Great. We have some shrubs. So Eric, would you mind putting the shrub poll up and having people just say, when do you think there are too many shrubs on a landscape? So if you just were in your area of the world, when is there too many shrubs? Or is that even possible? Obviously, we have a lot of fluctuations in our shrubs. And I bet if any of you guys have even walked around range, you've seen examples similar to all four of these pictures. So I can't see the results. Can you guys?
So I didn't see the results either, but
yeah, no,
there we go.
like I can maybe just chip in there for a second to give you guys, since you can't see them, it looks like a lot of people said it depends. Okay, like that's the major range answer, but about equal numbers say that 30% or 20 to 30% are good. Everybody wants to see more than 5 or 10. So it looks like people are in that 20 to 30 range.
Yes. So I didn't want to put it depends because that's always the answer, but we did. And it looks like a lot of you wrote that, but that's interesting, right? So when you look at that top left photo, just for some context, that's about a 25 or 20 to 25% cheatgrass, or oh my goodness, 20 to 25% sagebrush cover area. And a lot of times people think that's a lot more than what it actually is. But shrubs are hard to estimate, especially from this view or vantage point of these photos. So again, with it depends, right? It depends on your goals and objectives.
And I think, you know, like you said, you kind of look at it from a fuel standpoint, and we've had some pretty good discussions on, I think your viewpoint on the upper left is that there's a lot of fuel there that it would be good to reduce some of that, that sage. At 25%, you're probably looking at, even in wildlife for sage grouse, you're at the higher end of it. But as you look at some of the other photos, do you think, I mean, what's your opinion on the density of shrubs there? Do you think shrubs are a larger issue for those, for improvement, or other things?
Yeah, so great question. So let's look at the shrub cover and then look at the understory community. I think it's really important to see what's in those interspaces, right? So in that top left-hand photo, we actually have a pretty good perennial bunchgrass component. And because I want to make sure our community is resistant and resilient to fire, I want to make sure that those stay intact. So some of the research we did in Oregon was looking at the proximity of perennial bunchgrasses to an actual shrub. And if a grass is within 50 centimeters of a shrub, man, the mortality increases a lot. You have a 50% death. So anytime I see woody fuels and perennials, I want to reduce some of the woody species, not all of them, but to kind of create those mosaic patterns so that that wood doesn't kill the perennial bunch grasses. But if you look at the other photos, there's not always a healthy interspace community of perennial bunch grasses. So if you're facing an area where you have a lot of invasive annual grasses in some wood, you have to, I think, strategize a little bit differently in your management treatments. Can you remove some of the shrubs? either by an herbicide like spike or with mowing? And if you do that, do you need to go in and seed after? And if you seed, what's your competition going to be like for those seedlings?
And I think that's a great point, because I think you have way more options, and I would assume you'd agree with the upper left photo. You could run an aerator through it. You could potentially mow it without doing any kind of seeding. And the chances of your herbaceous community expanding in that and filling those voids is probably really high. The bottom left photo, that's mostly cheatgrass, and it's a drier site. I think even the bottom two, well, probably all the other sites. To treat those without doing any kind of seeding is a little bit harder. And I guess one question for you is, have you ever heard, or even out for the group, of any kind of drilling, an actual drilling treatment with those sagebrush cover percentages in either the bottom two photos or the upper right photo? How else would you seed that if you didn't want to get rid of all of those shrubs to get a herbaceous community in there, other than an aerator? Do you have any thoughts on that, April?
Yes.
Or the
So
group?
I don't know any of the literature that's looked specifically at drilling into these seeded treatments. I mean, obviously you're going to have some issues with your drill, right? And your seed soil contact. So that's really important that for some of the seeds, right, that you at least make that contact, if not some kind of covering on the seed. We did talk about using some more innovative approaches. I'll say innovative because there's not a ton of literature, although it's being done, by using cattle, for example, to go out, right? If you do some more intense grazing after you've seeded, will the cattle hoof action imprint those seeds and create kind of a microclimate for seeds to come back, as well as maybe removing some of that competition through the larger shrubs just by a movement, not necessarily consuming forage, but through that kind of practice. I also can't see questions, so
Yeah,
that's a great question, and I think people should think about it. But yeah, I probably wouldn't recommend drill seeding any of these based on my experiences. So then we have another question. So this is a juniper stand that's obviously burned, but Eric, would you mind putting up the question about seeding? So we just have another question. How many years would you rest from grazing following a seeding? And we know this is a tricky question, but typically in your experience, what would you recommend? And in the meantime, Mike, do you want to tell a little bit about this fire?
Yeah, so while people are answering this question, so the juniper photo on the upper left is not part of this fire, but it gives an idea of how juniper can encroach into a rangeland site. So this fire occurred, it was probably in 16-inch average precip zone, if not higher. It's just outside of Pocatello. And so we drill seeded it with a small ATV drill, and then you can kind of see the progression of how the grasses grow over years. I am interested to see what the response was, if Eric can post that. It did pop up on my screen the last time. There we go. So I don't know if everybody can see this, but it says graze immediately 4%, 1% or 25% was grazing it after the first grazing or growing season, 38% after 2 growing seasons, 6 at 3 to 4, and then most of them depends. So I'm going to close that out.
Most of them were 2 growing seasons. That's interesting. Most of them were 2 growing seasons.
Yeah. And so, I think this is a really interesting discussion, and I know it's always a discussion for everybody when we do post-fire treatments, but the same thing I think can go for treatments that are into cheatgrass sites that you've sprayed, let's say plateau, and you're going to seed into it, or other things. How long do you wait for that seed to grow before you potentially graze it? Again, I think it's hugely dependent on what your outcome is and what you seeded, and there's so many different things. But I'm going to run through, if you can let me screen share. I'm going to run through kind of, let's see if I can get this. So I'm
Yeah,
going
so what you're sharing, I was thinking, so Mike and I were talking about this earlier, and some of the things that would influence our decision on if we were to graze, and kind of where that 2-year rule came. That's kind of the rule of thumb, but it's reflective of the root mass, right, under the ground. You want to make sure that your plants are established so that they don't get ripped out of the ground and that they have enough photosynthetic tissue to last multiple years. So there you go,
right.
Mike.
So can you see my screen there, April?
Yes.
Okay. So so this is 2012. So this is October 2012 is when this fire area was seeded. In 2013, so the fall of 2013, this is basically what we achieved for grazing, or achieved for growing. So, you know, I was pretty worried. It was funny because April was like, well, it looks really good. And I actually looked at it and I was like, this doesn't look like very good seeding, which may be that she actually is more of a farmer than I am, or sees a lot more treatments. But I wasn't really convinced, and I was a little worried after the fall of 2013. So it had been the whole great growing season, and that's all we had achieved. By, you know, midsummer, early fall of 2014, so after two growing seasons, we had a pretty decent amount of grass growing. I would say they're vigorous plants. They were growing pretty tall, and I think typically this is where I would imagine if you're a private landowner, that's where you want to turn your cows on. I know a lot of producers usually want to turn cows on when they come out and see this. But after 3 years of no grazing, the plants really almost doubled in size. Their basal areas were just, you know, really large. The plants were really vigorous. It definitely increased in its overall height of each plant. So, you know, it's a really interesting question, and I think probably land managers struggle with this question the most. When do you feel that it's appropriate to put livestock back onto the range to graze this? I'm going to really quickly just zoom up and kind of show what happened with the precipitation, and this is where it was really interesting. So after 2013, so that was the fall of 2013, we looked at it in July, right? July, August. There hadn't been it was probably an average spring, but not great water, not a great water year. But by the next year, if you look at 2014, when we actually took that photo, I mean, again, average spring year, but after that photo was taken, I mean, we had just an immense amount of rain come into the fall. So those plants, being perennial plants, actually got to take advantage of all that fall rain. And then if you look at in 2015, we had a tremendous spring, which really allowed those plants to really take advantage of that water. And one thing that we've never done, and since April's a professor and she's also the extension agent, I'm going to be looking to her in the future to come out but what happened to the root systems on those plants? Generally, we don't dig those up or dig down a pit, 6 feet deep to see where those root masses kind of came about. But, is the difference between 2014 and 2015, was that a foot of root mass? Was that 6 inches? Was that 2 feet? And I think it's really important when you start looking at the long-term resilience, right? You talked about resilience and resistance to fire. At what point, and then if you started grazing in the 2014, does that reduce the amount of root mass that's produced every year after that? Does it kind of stunt it at that depth? Or does it allow it to continue to grow? And of course, there's all kinds of, do you graze at the full same level that you were grazing prior to the fire? There's all kinds of variables, but I think it's potentially important questions to ask. So I will turn this back over to you, if
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it came up earlier when we were talking about this. Is this a normal seeding that you guys see a lot of? Like, to me, this definitely looks like more of an exception. And I would definitely, well, like we said earlier, I would graze after 2 years because I looked at those perennial bunch grasses and they looked vigorous to me. And I, from a fuel perspective, thought there's a lot of fuel out there and I don't want it to burn again. But you're right? So I didn't know that it was going to be a really wet fall or spring. We don't have that luxury to know what's going to happen. So it's always a little bit tricky on what you do and what you don't do. But yeah, you're right. I think it's having these kind of conversations, and I'm excited to potentially do some research and look at those roots more thoroughly, right? Like what is happening to that underground biomass, because that is key to keep our plants longer and to be more resilient to wildfire in the end. All right, so we have just a few more minutes, but do you want to talk a little bit about juniper, or do we have some questions that we would rather spend time on?
You just want to go to we'll skip past maybe juniper, even though I do think it's a super interesting discussion and I say skip it, and then I'm going to say something real quick. But me and April, we've had a lot of discussions on this slide, and there's been several talks as early as 10 years ago that Utah State and other organizations have put on that I've attended, and there is a real question on if climate change is actually changing. Is juniper now the new dominant species? And so one of the discussions that we won't go into a lot here is that we've talked about is how long are we going to continue to knock back juniper if that site is going to be a juniper dominated site in the future. So with that, I won't allow any discussion. I'll just leave my opinion out there, and then we can go to the next slide.
Okay, well, you said your opinion, so I'm going to just share my opinion because we're having a discussion, and I obviously think we still need to treat juniper in certain places, right? There's a lot of encroaching happening, and whether climate's causing it or not, we still need to make sure we have healthy sagebrush plant communities for wildlife and livestock. So I'll just plug the Sage Step project. That website's up on the page, and you can see a lot of interesting results coming from that. And they did a lot of different treatments, fires, mastication, as well as the cut and fill treatment. And so if you're interested in this, you can definitely reach out or go to the sagestep.org website, and they have great information available. So I guess just to wrap it up, a few takeaways. Obviously, there's never one treatment that works everywhere. Rangelands are dynamic and complex, and as soon as we realize that, we can open up these chains of communication a little bit better. I think the second thing is really to work together to have goals and objectives as we move forward, to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're communicating with each other about the same thing when we look at our land. And then after these things have been acknowledged and discussed, then we can choose our strategies and tactics to get you where you want to be. With, of course, monitoring, because we still have to have a lot of flexibility, because who knows what's really going to happen. And that's why this is kind of fun. Well, it was really fun to me. So that is the end. Is there any questions, Mike?
Yeah, so April, there's a couple that I saw pop up, and I don't know how much time we have to address them, but so I'll read one of them. How would timing of grazing change the wait time after seeding? For example, with late fall, early winter grazing, light and quick, still have a detrimental effect on the root mass and subsequent growth. So with that question, and then there's another one that's I think plays really well with it is I think producers would say having more flexibility on when you start grazing a seeding post-fire is important. Dependent on how much precipitation occurs, flexibility is better than a hard and fast standard. And I know we've talked quite a bit on how that 2-year standard came. So I would say I agree with that. I think the flexibility for operators or anybody is really important. And I know me and you talked about this, but I think where it would be really interesting if it is public land that a treatment occurred on, and there's a producer or other interests that are looking at when to do some kind of use on the land that was just treated. The question of if it was their property, not public land, but if it was their property and they had invested $100,000 or $200,000 in a treatment, maybe looking at it from that standpoint of having that discussion of what is the best course of action after it's been treated to get to the result that everyone's happy. So what's your thoughts on that, on these two questions that were posted?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think we have to think long-term in a lot of these decisions, right? If you're making this investment, think about the future. So we don't want to do anything that's going to reduce our likelihood of those being successful. But and then on the flip side, when they talked about dormant grazing and on some plants, the science has shown that dormant plants being grazed, there's really not a root loss. And so I think with some flexibility and some timing, and then based on goals and objectives, we can graze differently than we are right now. But again, it's really complicated, and there's a lot of different factors that we have to consider. But I do think we need to be a little bit more flexible with that.
So here's a question I'm going to post for you. What monitoring sample techniques do you feel are most effective on rangelands, especially when shrubs are the main component?
I think the most effective monitoring for shrubs is more of a volume type measurement. It takes a little bit more time, but we all know that every shrub or cover isn't equal, right? And we can think about erosion potential and invasion potential, and the structure of the plants become really important. It becomes really important when they burn as well. They're going to burn differently based on that volume. If I was just doing a quick thing though, and I just wanted to assess the landscape, I would just go with a line point cover. But if you want details, I like volume the most.
Yeah, and I guess I have two additional ones on that. I think one, our office has tried to do a lot more drone technology, so flying areas, and our GIS person has actually, there's been some promising looks at actually looking at cover and looking, and also you can look at density, because GIS can actually put a point on each plant, so you can kind of look at it that way. So that's pretty interesting on the shrub side of it. The other thing I think is really important that we didn't get to talk a lot about, but on monitoring within shrubland community, is I think it's really important to look at over time, especially if you're looking at grazing. As shrub density increases, potentially your herbaceous vegetation decreases. And if you continue to graze potentially at a level that was collected, so your production was collected when it was a more herbaceous type community, you could really kind of set yourself up for detrimental effects as sagebrush increases.
All right, well, you guys have done a great job. This is Karen again. You can, we're going to go on to the next, if you'll quit sharing your screen, April. And you know what, Mike, you maybe should think about your future in podcasting. That was great. And April, it really is fun to see the two of you with some on-the-ground experience and then the science behind it. So thank you so much. I hope you guys have a chance to look in the Q&A. There were some good questions, but there were also some really good tips about where to find information. For example, to find when moisture is likely, etc. So for those of you who are sitting at your computer, take a look at that Q&A box. A lot of good information there. But I'm take over, and I'm going to switch